Think about the last time you looked at a map and saw those lines separating countries or states. They seem so definite, so permanent, like they've always been there. But what if I told you that long before modern nations and satellite-drawn boundaries, there were borders that shaped human destiny in ways far deeper and more mysterious? Picture a world where your entire sense of self, your language, your beliefs, who you considered friend or foe, could be determined by something as simple as a river's curve or a mountain's shadow. This is the hidden story of ancient borders, those powerful yet often invisible lines that divided lands and peoples, sparking both conflict and connection across millennia. These ancient dividers were so much more than lines on a map. They were living, breathing zones where cultures met, empires rose and fell, and identities were forged in the fires of geography and ambition. From the vast walls built by determined hands to the natural barriers shaped by the earth itself, these boundaries didn't just mark territory, they shaped history itself. They decided the fates of soldiers stationed at remote outposts, traders navigating unfamiliar routes, and families whose lives were split by a line they could not cross. And what's truly fascinating is how these ancient divisions still echo in our world today, influencing everything from modern political disputes to the way we understand our own cultural heritage. In this video, we're going to journey back in time to unravel the secrets of these ancient borders and the people whose lives were forever changed by them. We'll explore legendary structures like the Great Wall of China and the Roman limes, dive into the stories of those who lived on the edge of empires, and discover how rivers, mountains, and even beliefs carved up the ancient world. You'll come away with a new perspective on how division and unity have shaped human civilization, and how these age-old boundaries continue to influence the way we see ourselves and others today. So settle in and get ready to explore the enigmatic realm of ancient borders where every line tells a story. When we think about borders today, we often picture clear lines on a map, marked by checkpoints and official agreements between nations. But in the ancient world, borders were something entirely different. They were living, breathing spaces where the very essence of human experience played out. These weren't just simple dividers between us and them. They were complex zones of contact where cultures met, mixed, and sometimes clashed. Imagine standing on the bank of a great river like the Rhine in Roman times. To a soldier stationed there, that river was the edge of the known world, a barrier against the unknown tribes of Germania. But to a local trader, that same river was a highway, a place to exchange goods, ideas, and stories with people from both sides. This duality is what made ancient borders so fascinating. They were not just about keeping people out, they were also about bringing worlds together. These boundaries were often a blend of the natural and the man-made. A mountain range might form a formidable barrier, but a cleverly placed wall or a series of watchtowers could reinforce it, turning a geographical feature into a political statement. Take, for example, the frontiers of the Roman Empire. In some places, like northern Britain, they built Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone fortification cutting across the landscape. In other regions, like along the Danube River, they used the waterway itself as a border, supplementing it with forts and naval patrols. This flexibility shows that ancient societies understood borders as adaptable systems, not fixed lines. They could be expanded, contracted, or reinterpreted based on the needs of the empire, the movements of people, or the whims of a ruler. Beyond their military and political functions, these borders served as powerful symbols. They were a physical manifestation of a state's power and reach, a way to project authority into the wilderness and impress both citizens and potential adversaries. The Great Wall of China, for instance, was as much a psychological symbol of the emperor's strength and the divide between civilization and the nomadic steppes as it was a defensive structure. But perhaps their most profound impact was on the people who lived in their shadow. For those residing near a border, their identity became fluid. A person might speak the language of the empire but follow the local gods of their ancestors. They might trade with the soldiers stationed at the fort while maintaining family ties with communities on the other side. This created unique hybrid cultures that belonged neither entirely to one world nor the other, but to the vibrant and often tense space in between. This constant interplay of division and connection meant that ancient borders were never truly solid. They were permeable membranes. Ideas, technologies, and art styles flowed across them, often carried by merchants, diplomats, or even prisoners of war. A Roman coin might find its way into a Germanic chieftain's tomb. Greek architectural styles might influence temples in ancient India. This cultural exchange was an unintended consequence of drawing a line in the sand. It didn't just separate people, it inevitably forced them into a new kind of relationship. Understanding this complexity is crucial. It moves us beyond seeing ancient history as a collection of isolated civilizations and instead reveals a world deeply interconnected, where every border, no matter how heavily guarded, was ultimately a place of meeting. Geography truly was the master planner behind so many of history's most significant borders, a force that ancient civilizations had to either work with or desperately fight against. Think about it. Before we had the technology to build massive walls or draw precise lines on a map, the land itself provided the most obvious and enduring markers of territory. A towering mountain range wasn't just a beautiful backdrop. It was a formidable, almost insurmountable wall that required immense effort to cross. A wide, rushing river wasn't merely a source of water. It was a natural moat that could define the edge of an empire. And a vast, unforgiving desert wasn't just empty space. It was a terrifying void that few would dare to traverse, creating a perfect, if harsh, boundary. These features offered a kind of pre-made security, a first line of defense that required little extra investment from the people who claimed the land on one side. The ancient Egyptians provide a perfect case study in how a civilization could be both defined and protected by its geography. The Nile River was the absolute lifeblood of Egypt, its annual floods depositing rich, black silt that created a narrow strip of incredibly fertile land on either side. This strip, this ribbon of life snaking through the desert, effectively became the core of Egypt. But beyond that fertile zone lay the vast, arid expanse of the Sahara Desert. For the Egyptians, the desert wasn't really a place to be conquered or claimed. It was a natural border, a terrifying and deadly barrier that shielded them from large-scale invasions from the west. To the east, similar deserts and the Red Sea offered protection. To the north was the Mediterranean, and to the south, a series of cataracts, rocky, unnavigable rapids on the Nile made riverborne invasion from Nubia extremely difficult. Their entire worldview and their concept of their country's borders were shaped by this geography of a fertile corridor protected by a ring of desolation. On the other side of the world, the Indian subcontinent demonstrates a similar principle on a much grander scale. The entire region is practically walled off from the rest of Asia by the most dramatic geography on Earth, the Himalayan mountain range. These colossal peaks, including Mount Everest, the highest point on the planet, created a barrier so immense that it allowed a stunning diversity of cultures, languages, and kingdoms to flourish within the subcontinent with a degree of isolation. While passes like the Khyber Pass did allow for some movement and invasion, for the most part, the Himalayas served as a colossal shield, influencing the development of a uniquely Indian civilization that evolved with less frequent disruption from northern empires than other regions experienced. But it's a mistake to think of geography only as a tool of division. In many brilliant cases, ancient peoples saw the potential for connection within their natural world. Perhaps the best example of this is the Mediterranean Sea. To a land-based culture, a sea might look like a barrier, a watery end to the world. But to the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and later the Romans, the Mediterranean was the exact opposite. It was a highway. It was a vast, interconnected network of routes that was far easier and faster to travel than trudging over mountain passes or through dense forests. The sea didn't divide the ancient world of southern Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. It unified it. It facilitated trade in everything from olive oil and wine to precious metals and ideas. It allowed for the spread of alphabets, religious concepts, and artistic styles. The borders around the Mediterranean were not the coastlines themselves, but the ports and trading posts that dotted them, becoming cosmopolitan hubs where different worlds met and mingled thanks to the connective power of the sea. This relationship between people and their environment in shaping borders was a constant dance of pragmatism and adaptation. Sometimes, a society would embrace a geographic feature as a border because it was simply the most logical and defensible choice. Other times, they would overcome it, building roads through mountains or bridges across rivers to extend their influence and effectively redraw the map. The very existence of a border could change how people interacted with the geography itself. A mountain pass that was once just a trail used by shepherds might become a heavily fortified checkpoint once it was declared the official boundary between two warring kingdoms. This interplay shows us that ancient borders were never just passively accepted. They were a dynamic conversation between the unyielding will of nature and the ambitious, ingenious spirit of humanity. Of all the forces that shaped the ancient world, perhaps none were as immediate and undeniable as the natural boundaries provided by the earth itself. Before empires could muster the labor to build walls or the authority to decree lines on a map, they looked to the landscape for guidance. A surging river, a jagged mountain ridge, a vast desert. These were the first borders, etched not by human hands but by geology and time. They offered a kind of ready-made definition to a territory, a clear and defensible line that everyone could see and understand. A community living on one side of a major river knew, almost instinctively, that the people on the opposite bank were separate, part of a different world defined by the powerful flow of water between them. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of survival and security, using the planet's own architecture to mark the limits of control. Consider the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These two mighty waterways were the very source of life, their annual floods depositing the rich silt that made agriculture possible. But they also served as the first major political dividers. The fertile plain between them became the heartland of Sumer, a collection of powerful city-states like and Uruk. Yet the rivers themselves often marked the outer limits of their direct control, or became the contested frontiers with their northern neighbors, the Akkadians. To control the water was to control life, and so these natural features became the prizes over which wars were fought and treaties were signed. They weren't just borders in a passive sense, they were active participants in the political drama, shaping where power began and ended. Moving to a very different landscape, the Alps mountains stand as a classic example of a natural barrier that defined history. For the Roman Empire, these soaring peaks represented both a formidable challenge and a vital protective shield. From the perspective of Rome, the Alps separated the ordered, civilized world of Italy from the unpredictable and often threatening tribes of Germania. This massive wall of rock and ice forced armies to march through a handful of narrow, easily defensible passes, which became choke points of immense strategic importance. Hannibal's legendary, near-impossible crossing of the Alps with his war elephants in the Second Punic War wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a shocking event that violated the natural order, demonstrating a terrifying ability to overcome what everyone assumed was an insurmountable barrier. For centuries, the Alps gave Rome a psychological and military advantage, a natural fortification that required far less investment to defend than any man-made wall. But these natural borders did more than just dictate military strategy or mark political domains. They seeped into the very soul of cultures, becoming woven into their mythology and sense of identity. A river wasn't just a geographic feature, it was a god, a deity to be worshipped and appeased. The Nile was personified as the god Hapi, who brought the life-giving floods. For the ancient Greeks, Mount Olympus wasn't merely the highest mountain. It was the home of the gods, a literal and figurative border between the divine and the mortal realms. A tribe living in the shadow of a great mountain range might see it as a divine gift, a protective embrace from their gods. Another group, isolated by a treacherous desert, might view that same landscape as a curse or a test of their resilience. This spiritual dimension transformed geography from simple topography into a foundational element of a people's worldview, making the border not just a line on the land, but a line in their collective consciousness. While nature provided the initial blueprint for dividing the world, human ambition soon took over the drafting table, leading to the creation of some of history's most awe-inspiring and imposing structures, constructed fortifications. If natural borders were the gifts of geography, then these man-made walls were bold declarations of power, massive statements carved into the earth itself to announce where one civilization's domain ended and the wilderness or a rival's territory began. They represent a fundamental shift in thinking, from simply accepting the limits the world gave you to using sheer will, engineering genius, and vast amounts of labor to impose your own order upon it. These were not passive barriers but active instruments of control, designed to do far more than just keep people out. They were meant to intimidate, to regulate, and to proclaim the glory of the empire that built them for all to see. Perhaps no single structure embodies this concept more completely than the Great Wall of China. We often picture it as a single, continuous stone snake slithering across mountains, but this vision is a simplification of a much more complex reality. It was actually a massive, evolving network of walls built by different dynasties over centuries, each adding to and reinforcing the work of the last. Its primary purpose was defensive, a colossal effort to protect the settled, agricultural heart of China from the nomadic steppe tribes of the north, like the Xiongnu and later the Mongols, whose swift cavalry raids were a constant threat. But to see it only as a military barrier is to miss half of its story. The wall was also a sophisticated system of control and communication. Its watchtowers served as signal beacons, capable of relaying messages across vast distances using smoke or fire far faster than a messenger could ride. Its garrison towns became bustling centers where soldiers, who often served long tours of duty far from home, interacted with local populations and traders. Crucially, the wall was not a hermetically sealed barrier. It had gates heavily fortified and guarded, to be sure, but gates nonetheless. These were the official arteries of the Silk Road, where caravans laden with silk, spices, and ideas would be checked, taxed, and allowed to pass. In this way, the wall functioned as a colossal customs house, regulating the flow of goods and people, and enriching the empire it was built to protect. It was both a shield and a filter, demonstrating that the most effective ancient borders were rarely just about total exclusion. They were about managing interaction on the builder's own terms. The immense human cost of its construction, with countless laborers toiling and often perishing in the effort, also served a psychological purpose for the ruling emperor. It was the ultimate symbol of his absolute power to command both the landscape and his people, a permanent monument to his authority meant to endure long after his reign. On the other side of the world, another famous wall tells a similar story of ambition and control, though on a more intimate human scale. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles across the narrow neck of northern Britain, was the northwestern frontier of the Roman Empire. Built by Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, it was a clear statement of intent. Rome was ceasing its expansion and consolidating its gains. It physically separated the Roman province of Britannia from the lands of the northern tribes, particularly the Picts, whom the Romans considered barbarians. Constructed of stone and turf, it was a formidable military installation, bristling with forts, mile castles, and turrets manned by thousands of Roman auxiliary soldiers drawn from across the empire. Yet, just like the Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall quickly became more than a simple military barrier. It evolved into a vibrant economic and cultural zone. A thriving civilian settlement called a vicus sprouted up around almost every fort. These settlements were populated by merchants, families, and artisans who catered to the soldiers. Local tribes likely traded with these communities, exchanging goods and, inevitably, cultural influences. Roman soldiers stationed for years at a time would have formed relationships, learning local customs, and even starting families. The wall, therefore, didn't create a clean break between Roman and barbarian. It created a messy, dynamic, and interconnected borderland where identities blurred and a unique hybrid culture emerged. It was a place of constant negotiation, where a threat could come from the north one day and a trade delegation might arrive the next. What these two monumental constructions reveal is that ancient-built borders were masterful exercises in duality. They were simultaneously symbols of division and engines of connection. They projected military strength while facilitating economic exchange. They were designed to keep certain people out, but in doing so, they inevitably brought others together in new and unexpected ways. The stone and earth used to build them were not just physical materials. They were the building blocks of complex social, economic, and political relationships that defined life on the frontier for generations. They stand as timeless testaments to humanity's relentless drive to define its space, control its destiny, and leave an indelible mark upon the world, proving that a border is never just a wall, it is a world unto itself. But beyond the stone and mortar of walls and the immutable presence of mountains, there existed another kind of border, one that was invisible yet just as powerful. These were the cultural and linguistic dividers that could cleave a shared landscape into separate worlds. Imagine two communities living in neighboring valleys, able to see the smoke from each other's cooking fires, yet divided by a chasm of language, gods, and customs so vast they might as well have been on different continents. These intangible borders were often the most deeply felt, shaping identity from the inside out and defining who was a kinsman and who was a stranger with a potency that no river or wall could ever match. The ancient Greek world provides one of history's most vivid examples of this phenomenon. Geographically, the city-states of Athens and Sparta were remarkably close, both located on the Peloponnese Peninsula. Yet culturally, they were polar opposites, and this divide dictated their history. Athens celebrated intellectual pursuit, democracy, naval power, and artistic expression. Its agora buzzed with philosophical debate and political discourse. Sparta, in stark contrast, was a militaristic society built on discipline, austerity, and obedience. From childhood, its citizens were hardened for a life dedicated to the state's defense. They viewed Athenian sophistication with deep suspicion, seeing it as a corrupting weakness. This cultural chasm didn't just make them different, it made them perpetual rivals, leading to the devastating Peloponnesian War. They shared a language and a pantheon of gods, but their values and ways of life created an impenetrable border between them, proving that the most enduring conflicts are often born not from land disputes, but from clashes of culture. This power of language as a border is even more strikingly illustrated in ancient Mesopotamia. For centuries, the region was dominated by the Sumerian language, the tongue of the innovative city-states that invented writing itself. But then, Semitic-speaking Akkadians moved into the same area. The Akkadian language didn't just represent a different way of speaking, it became a marker of political and social change. When Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian cities, he made Akkadian the language of administration and power. For a time, the two languages existed side by side, creating a societal border. Being Sumerian-speaking might mark you as part of an ancient, respected tradition, while being Akkadian-speaking signified connection to the new ruling class. Eventually, Akkadian supplanted Sumerian entirely, but the linguistic border had served to reinforce a complete shift in the social and political hierarchy, showing how a language can be a weapon of conquest as effective as any army. Yet, for all their divisive power, these cultural borders were remarkably fluid and permeable. They were not walls but membranes, allowing for a constant, slow process of exchange and assimilation. A conquered people might adopt the language of their invaders over generations, but they would often infuse it with their own accents, words, and grammatical structures, creating a new dialect. Religious beliefs were particularly prone to this blending. When the Romans encountered the Greek gods, they didn't just reject them, they syncretized them, mapping Zeus onto Jupiter and Aphrodite onto Venus, effectively creating a new, shared Greco-Roman religious border that defined the classical world. A Roman citizen might make an offering to the Egyptian goddess Isis in a port city, showing how cultural practices could travel and take root far from their origin, softening the very borders they once represented. Ultimately, these invisible borders were constantly being negotiated and reinforced through the smallest of daily actions. They were maintained in the rituals performed at a local temple that were unintelligible to an outsider just a few miles away. They were etched into identity through the specific way people dressed, the food they ate, and the stories they told their children around the fire. A shared myth about a founding hero could create a powerful sense of us, while a different origin story for a neighboring tribe clearly defined them. These cultural markers were the true fences of the ancient world, built not from stone but from tradition and belief. They remind us that sometimes the most formidable borders are the ones you cannot see, the ones that exist in the human heart and mind, shaping alliances and enmities long before any king ever thought to draw a line on a map. While stone walls and mountain ranges defined many ancient borders, some of the most dynamic and influential dividers were drawn not by soldiers or surveyors, but by merchants and the relentless pursuit of wealth. These were the economic borders, invisible lines that materialized around precious resources and bustling trade routes, creating zones where profit was the ultimate priority and control over commerce could make or break an empire. Unlike static fortifications, these borders were fluid, constantly shifting with the winds of supply and demand, turning entire regions into grand arenas for both cooperation and fierce competition. They remind us that ancient conflicts and alliances were often fueled by something as simple yet powerful as the desire for salt, silk, or silver. The most legendary example of this is without a doubt the Silk Road. We often picture it as a single, romantic caravan trail stretching from China to Rome, but in reality, it was a vast, sprawling network of overland and maritime routes, a web of pathways connecting countless cultures. This network didn't just transport luxurious silk and pungent spices. It moved technologies, religions, artistic styles, and even diseases. But for all its role as a connector, the Silk Road was also a creator of borders. Control over key segments of this route was a paramount strategic goal for empires. The powerful Han dynasty in China fought protracted wars with the nomadic Qiongnu Confederation, not just for territory, but to secure safe passage for their caravans westward. The Parthian Empire, positioned squarely between Rome and China, jealously guarded its section of the route, often acting as a middleman and deliberately obscuring the origins of silk to maintain their lucrative monopoly. The oases that dotted these arid routes, like the magnificent city of Palmyra, grew immensely wealthy by controlling the water and services that caravans desperately needed. These oases became fortified economic islands, their borders defined by their ability to tax and protect trade, making them prizes that empires would fight to the death to control. This phenomenon wasn't limited to overland routes. The ancient city of Carthage in North Africa built its entire identity and power around economic borders. Its dominance was not defined by vast tracts of inland territory, but by its mastery of the sea lanes in the western Mediterranean. Carthaginian merchants established a network of trading posts and colonies from Sicily to Spain, creating an economic sphere of influence that was, in effect, a maritime empire. Their borders were the coastlines they controlled and the sea routes they patrolled. They fiercely defended these commercial domains, leading to inevitable and brutal conflicts with other rising trading powers, most notably Rome. The Punic Wars were, at their heart, a colossal clash over who would control the economic borders of the Mediterranean, a struggle for trade supremacy that would decide the fate of the classical world. Beyond the flow of goods, the sources of those goods themselves became some of the most fiercely contested border zones in antiquity. Consider something as simple as salt. In a world before refrigeration, salt was essential for preserving food, making it literally worth its weight in gold. Control over salt mines, like those in the Sahara Desert or the ancient mine at Hallstatt in Austria, created powerful economic kingdoms whose borders were drawn around these precious deposits. Similarly, the silver mines of Laurion in Greece provided the wealth that financed the Athenian fleet, the instrument that built and sustained their empire. The gold mines of Nubia were a primary driver of Egyptian southward expansion, turning the Nile's cataracts into a fortified economic borderland. Whoever controlled the resource controlled the wealth, and armies were sent and borders were redrawn not for glory alone, but to secure the mines, forests, and fertile lands that fueled entire economies. What makes these economic borders so fascinating is their inherent duality. A trading hub like Palmyra was simultaneously a bridge and a barrier. It was a bridge that connected the Roman and Persian worlds, a place where different cultures could meet and exchange ideas in a cosmopolitan atmosphere. Yet it was also a barrier for those who wished to bypass it. Its very existence and control over tariffs meant it regulated who passed through and under what terms. This created a unique environment where cooperation was essential for profit, even among rivals. A Roman merchant and a Parthian official might deeply distrust each other's empires, but at the border market, they would negotiate and trade because it was mutually beneficial. This necessity for interaction meant that economic borders, perhaps more than any other type, were places where cultural blending was not just possible but inevitable. Languages mixed, religious beliefs syncretized, and new hybrid art forms emerged in these zones of commercial exchange, proving that the pursuit of profit could sometimes be a more powerful force for connection than the most impassable mountain range. While walls of stone and flows of trade created tangible borders, some of the most powerful and enduring dividers in the ancient world were those drawn by faith and the divine. These religious and sacred boundaries transformed geography into theology, marking certain spaces as so spiritually significant that they became the very heart of a people's identity, worth living for and certainly worth dying to defend. Unlike a river that anyone could cross or a wall that could be breached, these borders existed in the collective belief of a community, making them invisible to the eye but unshakable in the soul. They could define the limits of an empire's ambition or create pathways of connection that transcended political rivalries, proving that the most potent lines are often those we believe the gods themselves have drawn. In ancient India, the concept of dharma provided a profound spiritual framework that directly influenced territorial expansion and the creation of borders. For rulers of the mighty Maurya Empire, like the famed Ashoka, conquest wasn't merely a quest for land and resources. It was often seen as a sacred duty, a means of spreading a righteous moral order. A region wasn't just valuable for its fertile soil or strategic location. It could be considered spiritually significant, a place mentioned in sacred texts or associated with the lives of saints and deities. Protecting such a place became a matter of defending Dharma itself, blurring the line between king and priest, between palace and temple. The empire's borders, therefore, were not just political boundaries but were envisioned as the limits of a cosmic order, a realm where the king's law was in harmony with divine law. This infused expansion with a religious fervor and made the defense of territory a spiritual imperative, creating borders that were consecrated by belief. 1,000 miles to the west, in the ancient city of Jerusalem, stood a structure that perfectly exemplifies the fusion of religious, cultural, and political borders, the Jewish Temple. For the Jewish people, the Temple Mount was not just a religious center, it was the literal dwelling place of God's presence on earth, the focal point of creation itself. Its precise architectural boundaries, from the outer courts accessible to Gentiles to the innermost holy of holies where only the high priest could enter, created a meticulously ordered sacred geography. These boundaries defined purity, access, and identity. To violate them was the ultimate sacrilege. When foreign powers like the Romans sought to subjugate Judea, they understood that controlling the temple was key to controlling the people. But for the Jews, the defense of the temple's sanctity was a defense of their very existence as a nation. Its destruction by the Romans in 70 AD was not just the loss of a building, it was a catastrophic erasure of their spiritual and political heart, a border so central that its loss sent the community into an exile that would last for nearly 2,000 years. Yet for every sacred border that divided, there was another designed to connect. Pilgrimage routes across the ancient world functioned as unique, moving borders of faith. Consider the pathways leading to the oracle at Delphi in Greece. For centuries, Greeks from warring city-states would set aside conflicts to travel to this sacred site, their shared reverence for Apollo creating a temporary, portable community of believers that transcended political hatreds. The journey itself became a sacred act, and the routes they traveled were lined with shrines and offering pits, effectively marking a religious corridor through the secular landscape. Similarly, in ancient India, routes to sacred sites like Varanasi on the Ganges River saw a constant flow of pilgrims from different kingdoms and social strata. For the duration of their journey, these travelers existed in a special state, their purpose creating an invisible boundary that offered them protection and a shared identity that momentarily overrode their earthly divisions. These pilgrimage highways show that sacred borders could be inclusive, creating vast networks of cultural and religious exchange that bound diverse peoples together in a common purpose. This spiritual dimension meant that a border could be as small as a single rock or tree deemed holy by a local tribe, or as vast as the Islamic concept of Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb, which divided the world into the House of Peace and the House of War based on the rule of divine law. A battlefield could be consecrated by priests before a fight, turning it into a ritual space where the outcome was believed to be judged by the gods. A treaty sworn at a border shrine was considered far more binding than one signed in a palace because it invoked divine witnesses. This imbuing of borders with cosmic significance made them far more resilient than any treaty written on parchment. They were woven into prayers, hymns, and foundational stories passed down through generations. Even if an empire fell and its walls crumbled to dust, the memory of its sacred boundaries could persist, guiding the longings and loyalties of its people for millennia, waiting for the moment when faith might once again dictate the lines on a map. To truly grasp the ingenuity of the Roman limes, we must first understand the sheer scale and ambition of this project. It was not a single, continuous wall like its famous counterpart in China, but rather an integrated defensive system that stretched for thousands of miles from the misty shores of the North Sea in what is now the Netherlands all the way to the Black Sea. In some sectors, it leveraged the immense power of natural boundaries, the mighty Rhine and Danube rivers serving as liquid ramparts patrolled by the Roman navy. In other places, particularly in the rolling hills of Germania and the forests of Britain, the Romans constructed formidable physical barriers, wooden palisades, earthworks, and stone walls, all punctuated by an intimidating network of forts, watchtowers, and garrison towns. This hybrid approach shows a remarkable adaptability, a willingness to use whatever the landscape offered and then supplement it with staggering military engineering to create a controlled frontier. The primary stated purpose of the limes was, of course, military. It was the definitive edge of the Roman world, designed to regulate movement, deter large-scale invasions from Germanic tribes, and provide an early warning system. A sentry in a watchtower could spot smoke or movement miles away and signal to the next tower using flags or fire, relaying a message down the line at incredible speed. Legions stationed in large forts like those at Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, or Mogontiacum, modern Mainz, could be mobilized rapidly to respond to threats. It was a colossal investment in manpower and resources, a permanent standing army deployed along a static line, representing both the immense power of Rome and its very real vulnerabilities. The limes was a statement of empire, a clear physical manifestation of where Roman law and order ended and the perceived chaos of the Barbaricum began. But the most fascinating story of the limes is not what it kept out, but what it created along its length. This military zone inevitably became a vibrant economic and cultural corridor. Each major fort attracted a civilian settlement, a vicus which buzzed with activity. Local tribespeople would come to these towns to trade goods, amber, furs, and slaves from beyond the frontier for Roman wine, fine pottery, glassware, and coinage. Roman soldiers, many of whom were recruited from provincial backgrounds themselves and served 25-year postings, put down roots. They married local women, started families, and upon retirement were often granted land nearby. This daily, intimate contact between thousands of Romans and the local Germanic and Celtic peoples led to a profound and lasting cultural synthesis. the influence flowed in both directions. While the local populations were certainly Romanized, adopting Latin dialects, building in Roman style, and using Roman goods, the Roman army itself was transformed by its border postings. Soldiers adopted local dietary habits, religious practices, and even styles of dress. Altars found along the limes are dedicated to a fascinating blend of deities. Classical Roman gods like Jupiter stand alongside local Germanic mother goddesses and Celtic horse gods, sometimes merged into a single, unique frontier divinity. This created a distinct borderland culture, a hybrid identity that was neither purely Roman nor entirely native. A person living in a town like Augusta Vindelicorum, modern Augsburg, might have a Roman-style home, speak a vulgar Latin dialect, but still honor the old tribal gods of their ancestors. The long-term legacy of this interaction is etched into the very map of Europe today. The path of the limes roughly corresponds to some of the most enduring cultural and linguistic divides on the continent. To the south and west of the old frontier, Romance languages Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian evolved from the vulgar Latin spoken by soldiers and settlers. To the north and east, Germanic languages remained dominant. The limes helped create this linguistic fault line, a permanent cultural imprint left by centuries of Roman presence. Furthermore, many of the great cities of Western Europe, Cologne, Vienna, Budapest, Strasbourg, began their lives as Roman frontier forts or the civilian settlements that grew up beside them. Their very foundations are Roman. The limes, therefore, was not a failure that collapsed with the empire. It was a crucible that forged a new Europe, proving that a border designed for division could ultimately become one of history's most powerful and unexpected engines of connection, whose echoes we still live with today. Yet for all its imposing physical presence, the Great Wall of China represents something far deeper than stone and mortar. It stands as the ultimate expression of a profound cultural and psychological divide that shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. This wasn't just a barrier against armies. It was the physical manifestation of a fundamental worldview that distinguished the settled, agricultural society of China from the nomadic, pastoral cultures of the steppes. To the Chinese emperors and their subjects, the wall marked the boundary between order and chaos, between cultivated fields and untamed wilderness, between what they saw as civilization and what they perceived as barbarism. This philosophical distinction was so deeply ingrained that the wall became more than a defensive structure. It became a cultural icon, a symbol of Chinese resilience and determination to preserve their way of life against the unpredictable forces beyond their borders. The construction history of the wall reveals this evolving purpose across dynasties. The first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, connected and fortified existing walls in the 3rd century BCE, but these early fortifications were largely earthen ramparts. The magnificent stone structure we recognize today primarily dates from the Ming dynasty, some 1500 years later, when the threat from Mongol tribes had become particularly acute. The Ming invested staggering resources into building what became the most extensive fortification system the world had ever seen, with watchtowers placed at regular intervals capable of signaling messages across vast distances using smoke or fire. The construction itself was a monumental undertaking that required incredible logistical organization, with materials transported across impossible terrain and workers conscripted from across the empire. Many never returned home, their bodies literally becoming part of the wall they built, a sobering reminder that this symbol of national unity was also built on immense human suffering and sacrifice. Despite its fearsome reputation as an impenetrable barrier, the wall functioned more as a controlled gateway than an absolute seal. Strategic passes like the famous Jade Gate in the west served as crucial checkpoints along the Silk Road, where caravans laden with silk, spices, and other precious goods would be inspected, taxed, and granted passage. These points of controlled exchange became vibrant centers of cultural and economic interaction, where Chinese merchants traded with Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and even European travelers. Through these gates flowed not only goods but also ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs. Buddhism entered China through these northern routes, forever transforming Chinese culture. The wall, therefore, operated as a sophisticated filter rather than a simple barrier, allowing the empire to regulate and benefit from cross-border exchange while attempting to control military threats. The psychological impact of the wall extended far beyond its physical presence, shaping Chinese identity in profound ways. It created a powerful sense of what scholars call the Middle Kingdom mentality, the belief that China was the cultural and political center of the world, protected by this magnificent bulwark from the chaotic outside. This worldview influenced foreign policy, cultural attitudes, and even artistic expressions for centuries. The wall appeared in poetry, painting, and folklore, not just as a structure but as a symbol of national endurance, a testament to the Chinese people's ability to overcome tremendous challenges through collective effort and imperial will. During times of foreign invasion, such as the Mongol conquest or later Manchu rule, the wall took on additional layers of meaning, both as a reminder of failed defense and as a symbol of cultural continuity that outlasted even military defeat. Today, the Great Wall's significance continues to evolve while retaining its powerful symbolic weight. It has been transformed from a functional border into a national monument and UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing millions of visitors who walk its ramparts not for defense but for reflection. For modern China, it represents both an engineering marvel that inspires national pride and a complicated legacy of isolationism and immense human cost. Scholars continue to debate its actual military effectiveness. Many invasions successfully crossed it throughout history, but its cultural and psychological impact is undeniable. The Great Wall endures as perhaps the most powerful example of how ancient borders transcended their practical functions to become enduring symbols of civilization's eternal struggle to define itself against the unknown, creating divisions that shaped not just territories but the very consciousness of a people for generations. Moving from the imposing walls of Rome and China, we arrive at a civilization that defies our very notion of ancient borders, the Indus Valley civilization, which thrived over 4,000 years ago in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, presents a fascinating paradox. It was one of the most extensive and sophisticated societies of its time, yet it appears to have managed its territory without the massive fortifications or clearly defined political boundaries we've come to expect. This was a world where borders were not lines drawn in stone or earth, but rather fluid zones of cultural and economic influence, shaped by geography and connection rather than conquest and exclusion. The most striking evidence of this unique approach lies in the remarkable uniformity found across its major cities, like the meticulously planned metropolises of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Archaeologists have uncovered a stunning level of standardization that speaks to a powerful, shared cultural identity. From the weights and measures used in marketplaces to the specific dimensions of the bricks that built their homes and the elaborate grid patterns of their streets, these cities followed the same blueprint across vast distances. This suggests a civilization bound not by a centralized emperor issuing decrees from a palace, but by a common set of ideas, technological practices, and perhaps a shared belief system. Their unity was expressed through consistency in daily life and commerce, creating an invisible cultural border that defined who belonged to this sophisticated network without the need for walls or armies to patrol a hard frontier. This cultural cohesion was powerfully reinforced by a vast economic network that reached far beyond the core river valleys. Indus Valley seals, featuring intricate animal motifs and a still undeciphered script, have been found in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities like indicating a thriving long-distance trade. They exported precious materials like carnelian gemstones, ivory, and exotic woods, importing in return metals and other goods. This constant flow of materials and people along established routes created a different kind of border, an economic one. The border was not a line to be defended, but a web of connections to be maintained. It existed at the coastal trading posts and the mountain passes where goods changed hands, blurring the lines between the Indus world and its neighbors through mutually beneficial exchange rather than conflict. The civilization's relationship with its natural environment further illustrates this fluid concept of space. The lifeblood of the Indus Valley was, of course, the Indus River system itself, which provided water, fertile silt, and a transportation network. This geography naturally defined their heartland, yet their sphere of influence extended into surrounding regions, adapting to different landscapes. There is little evidence of the massive, centralized irrigation systems seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Instead, they seem to have employed more localized water management, suggesting a society that worked with its environment rather than seeking to dominate and rigidly control it. Their borders ebbed and flowed with the practical realities of agriculture and resource availability, not the abstract ambitions of a ruler. This all makes the civilization's eventual decline around 1900 BC so profoundly instructive. Without rigid, fortified borders, their society may have been more resilient to certain shocks, but it also appears to have been incredibly vulnerable to others. Mounting evidence points to a major factor being environmental change, including a shift in monsoon patterns and the possible drying up of the Gaga-Hakra river system, which would have devastated their agricultural base. As the environment shifted, the very economic and cultural connections that defined their world may have strained and snapped. The standardized weights and measures lost their meaning when there was less to weigh and measure. The trade routes faltered, the cultural glue that held everything together dissolved. In the end, the Indus Valley civilization teaches us that the most enduring borders are not always the most visible ones. Their story is a powerful lesson in how a society built on shared ideas and economic interconnection can flourish without walls, but also how fragile that prosperity can be when the environmental and economic foundations it rests upon begin to crumble and change. These invisible lines carved into the landscape did far more than mark the edge of a kingdom's control. They carved the very contours of human identity, defining who people believed they were and where they truly belonged. A border was a powerful story a society told itself, a narrative of us and them that became so deeply ingrained it felt like a natural fact, shaping loyalties, prejudices, and a sense of place for generations. This process of identity making often began with the most fundamental human trait, language. In the fractured world of ancient Greece, a person's identity was not primarily defined by their citizenship in a specific city-state like Athens or Sparta, but by their ability to speak Greek. To them, the melodious flow of their own language was the sound of civilization, while the speech of outsiders sounded like a nonsensical bar, the origin of the word barbarian. This linguistic border created a powerful pan-Hellenic identity that could temporarily unite fiercely independent rivals when facing an external threat like the Persian Empire. A Greek mercenary fighting in a foreign land would feel an instant kinship with another Greek speaker, even from a rival city, because they shared a cultural world defined by Homer's poetry, the Olympic Games, and a common pantheon of gods. The border here wasn't just a line on a map, it was a line drawn by the tongue, separating the civilized from the uncivilized in the Greek imagination. The Persian Empire, which the Greeks so feared, took a brilliantly different approach to managing identity across its vast and diverse territories. Instead of trying to erase local cultures, the Achaemenid kings administered their empire through a system of provinces called satrapies. Each satrapy was allowed to retain its own local rulers, customs, languages, and religious practices, so long as they remained loyal to the King of Kings and paid their required tribute. This created a fascinating layered identity. A craftsman in Egypt might identify first and foremost as an Egyptian, worshipping the old gods and speaking Demotic Egyptian in his daily life. But he also existed within the broader framework of being a subject of the Persian Empire, an identity that brought with it the benefits of protected trade routes, a standardized currency, and the immense prestige of being part of a world power. He belonged to two worlds simultaneously, his local community and the vast imperial project. This policy of tolerance was not just benevolent, it was pragmatic, understanding that forced assimilation creates rebellion, while respecting cultural borders within an empire can foster a more stable and lasting sense of belonging to the whole. Some of the most powerful and enduring borders, however, were not between empires but within a single society. In ancient India, the Varna system, often simplified as the caste system, created rigid internal borders based on ritual purity and occupation. These were not borders you could see on the land, but they were borders you could not cross in life. Your social identity and your sense of belonging were determined by the family you were born into, locking you into a specific role: priest, warrior, merchant, or laborer, with its own rules, duties, and restrictions. These internal borders governed every aspect of life: who you could marry, what food you could eat, and even how you could interact with members of other groups. This system created a profoundly segmented society where belonging was hyper-localized to one's jati, or sub-caste, and the concept of a unified national identity was secondary to these deep, socially enforced divisions. The border was not a wall or a river, but a social and religious concept so powerful it structured civilization for millennia. Ultimately, these ancient processes of identity formation reveal that borders are as much psychological constructs as physical ones. They live in the mind. They are the stories we use to make sense of a complex world, creating categories that provide comfort and order, but also justify exclusion and conflict. The legacy of these ancient divisions is profound. The very words we use today, barbarian, politics, caste, carry the echoes of these old divides. They remind us that the human need to belong to a group is often defined by where we draw the line, and that those lines, whether made of stone, law, or pure belief, have always had the power to shape not just kingdoms but the human heart itself. To truly understand the human dimension of these ancient divides, we must move beyond the grand strategies of emperors and the sweeping arcs of history, and step into the worn sandals of those who actually lived on the edge of empires. These borderlands were not abstract lines but vibrant, often precarious worlds populated by individuals making impossible choices every single day. Consider the life of a Roman auxiliary soldier, perhaps recruited from a Gallic tribe, now stationed at a lonely fort along Hadrian's wall. His reality was a study in contradictions. He wore Roman armor, followed Roman commands, and drew a Roman salary, yet he might spend his entire 25-year service staring out at the misty hills of a land that was never truly conquered. His loyalty was bought, not born, and his daily existence was a tense balance between enforcing the empire's will on the local population and perhaps secretly trading with them, marrying a local woman, and forging a hybrid life in the shadow of the very wall that was meant to keep their worlds apart. For him, the border was not a symbol of power but the backdrop to his entire adult life, a place of bone-chilling cold, profound boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, and the slow, quiet creation of a new, blended identity that belonged neither to Rome nor to the ancient tribes of Britain. On the other side of that wall, the perspective was entirely different. For a chieftain of the Brigantes tribe, the Roman frontier was an existential threat and an irresistible opportunity. The massive stone barrier was a blatant declaration that his people's traditional lands were now cut in two, their movement and old ways of life suddenly restricted by a foreign power. Yet the same wall also presented new possibilities. The Roman garrison needed supplies, grain, leather, meat. Engaging in trade could bring wealth and prestige, but it was a dangerous game. Too much cooperation could be seen as collaboration by other tribes, risking his standing and even his life, but opposing Rome too openly invited devastating retribution. His leadership was a constant, high-stakes negotiation, navigating between the proud independence of his people and the pragmatic need to survive in the shadow of an overwhelming military machine. The border forced him to become a diplomat, a trader, and a resistance leader all at once, his every decision shaping the fate of his community. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, an entirely different kind of border life was unfolding along the dusty tracks of the Silk Road. Picture a Sogdian merchant from Samarkand, guiding his camel caravan through the towering gates of a bustling oasis city like Dunhuang. His entire world was movement and exchange. He didn't just cross borders, he lived in the spaces between them. His survival depended on a vast mental map not just of geography, but of cultures, languages, and customs. He needed to know which local official could be bribed, which deity to make a small offering to for safe passage, and how to negotiate a fair price for his bolts of silk in a dozen different dialects. He was a cultural chameleon, adapting his dress, his manners, and even his beliefs to suit his surroundings. In his saddlebags, he carried more than just goods, he carried ideas. A new design for a water wheel, a forgotten medical text, the tenets of a strange religion called Buddhism. All these could be traded as easily as spices, slowly filtering from one civilization to another through the actions of this one pragmatic traveler. For him, the border was not a barrier but a marketplace, a threshold of opportunity where the greatest profit was made from connection, not separation. And what of the families who called these frontier zones home? Theirs was a life of perpetual in-betweenness. A child growing up in a town near the Roman limes would likely speak a pidgin Latin mixed with local Celtic or Germanic words. Their diet would be a fusion of imported Roman wheat and local barley. They might celebrate the festival of Saturnalia alongside much older tribal solstice rites. Their identity was a patchwork, a practical blend of the dominant imperial culture and the enduring traditions of their ancestors. This created a unique frontier consciousness, a perspective that understood both sides of the divide and often served as a crucial buffer, translating not just languages but entire worldviews between the center of the empire and the territories beyond its direct control. Their very existence was a quiet act of defiance against the idea of a clean, simple border, proving that human communities are remarkably resistant to the lines drawn by distant powers. These personal stories, from the homesick soldier to the cunning merchant to the hybrid child, are the true heart of ancient border history. They remind us that while empires drew the lines, it was ordinary people who had to live with them, navigate them, and ultimately, through their daily acts of resilience and adaptation, redefine what those lines actually meant. This constant tension between separation and interaction meant that ancient borders were never simply places of endless war. They were complex stages where the drama of human relationship played out in all its forms. It's easy to focus on the conflicts, and indeed, borders were frequently the spark that lit the powder keg of war. The struggle between the Egyptian New Kingdom and the Hittite Empire over the strategic region of Syria is a classic example of a borderland becoming a perpetual battlefield. For both of these Bronze Age superpowers, control of the Syrian cities and trade routes was a matter of economic survival and imperial prestige. This led to generations of military campaigns, including the legendary Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, where Pharaoh Ramesses II and King Muwatalli II clashed with thousands of chariots in a fight for supremacy. The border was not a settled line but a violently contested zone, a bloody tug of war that consumed vast resources and countless lives. Similarly, the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE pitted the Athenian maritime empire against the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League. While the core issue was a struggle for hegemony over the Greek world, it was fought over a network of alliances and client states that existed along the blurred borders of their respective spheres of influence. A dispute over a minor border town could, and did, draw the entire Greek world into a decades-long war that shattered the golden age of Athenian power. Yet, for every story of conflict, there is a counter-narrative of astonishing cooperation that emerged from these very same pressure points. The same Battle of Kadesh that exemplified brutal conflict also resulted in one of history's most remarkable peace treaties. The Treaty of Kadesh, recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, survives as the earliest known international peace agreement. It didn't just end hostilities, it established a formal border, a mutual defense pact against third parties, and even an extradition agreement for fugitives. It was a sophisticated diplomatic instrument that recognized a simple truth. A stable, agreed-upon border was ultimately more valuable than the uncertain gains of perpetual war. This spirit of pragmatic cooperation extended far beyond high-level diplomacy. All along these ancient frontiers, a quieter, more persistent form of exchange was constantly at work. Border markets flourished where official relations were tense. A Roman soldier on the Danube might trade his silver denarius for fine Germanic pottery or amber jewelry, each transaction a tiny act of diplomacy that built a web of economic interdependence. These interactions created a vested interest in stability on both sides. A local chieftain who profited from trade with a Roman fort was less likely to raid it. This daily interplay inevitably led to a profound softening of cultural divisions. Intermarriage between communities on either side of a border was common, weaving families together across political lines. A Roman veteran who settled near his old post on the Rhine might marry a local woman, and their children would inherit a blended identity, speaking Latin and a Germanic dialect, honoring both Roman lairs and tribal household gods. Cultural and religious festivals often served as temporary truces, times when people from opposing sides could gather in a shared sacred space. The Olympic Games in Greece mandated a cessation of all hostilities among the warring city-states to allow athletes and spectators safe passage. For a brief period, the border between enemy states became permeable, all for the sake of a shared cultural event. This constant, grassroots blending of peoples, goods, and ideas meant that even the most heavily fortified border was, in practice, a membrane. It was a dynamic interface where identities were negotiated and renegotiated every day. proving that the human impulse to connect could persist even in the shadow of empires primed for war. The long-vanished walls and forgotten frontier posts of antiquity are far more than just relics for archaeologists to study. They are active, living forces that continue to shape the world we live in today. If you look at a modern political map of Europe, you can still trace the ghostly outline of the Roman limes. That 2,000-year-old frontier system didn't just vanish with the empire. It left an indelible mark that roughly corresponds to one of the continent's most significant cultural and linguistic divides. To the south and west of this ancient line, you'll find the Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian, all of which evolved from the Vulgar Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and settlers. To the north and east, the Germanic languages dominate. This is no mere coincidence. The limes created a zone of intense Roman cultural influence that lasted for centuries, effectively planting the seeds for a linguistic border that would harden and endure long after the last Roman legion had departed. The very cities that began as Roman frontier forts, places like Cologne, Vienna, and Budapest, are now major European capitals, their foundations literally and culturally built upon that ancient divide. On the other side of the globe, the Great Wall of China transcends its original purpose as a defensive fortification to stand as one of history's most potent and enduring national symbols. In the modern Chinese consciousness, it is not remembered for its military failures or the immense human cost of its construction, but as an eternal testament to national resilience, ingenuity, and unity. It is a symbol so powerful that it has been woven into the very fabric of the country's identity, featured on its currency, and serving as a foundational pillar of national pride. The wall's legacy is a psychological one, reinforcing an ancient concept of China as a unique and enduring civilization that has successfully defended its culture against outside forces for millennia. This symbolism is actively promoted today, reminding the Chinese people of their long history and collective strength, proving that a border's greatest power can sometimes lie not in its physicality, but in its enduring place in the heart of a nation. Perhaps nowhere is the legacy of ancient borders more volatile than in the Middle East, a region where the ghosts of empires past are constantly clashing with the realities of the modern state system. Many of the borders drawn across the sand in the early 20th century by European powers paid little heed to the ancient cultural, tribal, and religious landscapes. They arbitrarily carved up the territories of the Ottoman Empire, often ignoring the much older frontiers of the Mesopotamian and Persian worlds. The modern nation-state of Iraq, for instance, was created by combining three Ottoman provinces that housed deeply divided groups: Shiites in the south, Sunnis in the center, and Kurds in the north. These groups have ancient, distinct identities whose historical territories and rivalries stretch back for centuries, if not millennia. The modern border lines drawn on a map in European capitals failed to erase these deep-seated divisions, and the ongoing struggles for power and autonomy within Iraq can be seen as a violent attempt to reconcile these ancient identities with a very modern political geography. Understanding this deep historical layering is absolutely crucial for making sense of today's most pressing geopolitical issues. The conflict between India and Pakistan over the Kashmir region isn't just a post-war dispute. It is rooted in centuries of princely state rule and the much older cultural and religious divides of the Indian subcontinent. The tensions in the South China Sea are fueled not only by modern resource claims, but also by historical narratives stretching back to ancient tributary systems and maritime boundaries that are now being weaponized for contemporary nationalistic purposes. Even the debate over immigration and cultural identity in Europe and the United States often subconsciously echoes ancient fears of the barbarian at the gate, a concept literally born on the Roman frontier. These are not just arguments about policy, they are the latest chapters in stories that began thousands of years ago. The past is not a separate country, it is the very ground upon which our present is built, and the ancient lines we once drew in the sand and stone continue to guide the flow of human conflict, cooperation, and identity in ways we are only beginning to fully comprehend. Long before cartographers could chart the world with precision, it was the storytellers and myth weavers who gave shape to the unknown, using the power of narrative to carve mental maps onto the landscape. These mythological borders were far more potent than any wall or river. They were etched into the very soul of a culture, providing a divine justification for why we are here and they are there. A mountain wasn't just a geological feature, it was the abode of a god, a place of awe and danger that marked the limit of safe and sacred space. A river wasn't merely a body of water, it was a deity to be appeased, a spiritual boundary that separated the world of order from the realms of chaos. This sacred geography provided an unshakable foundation for a community's identity, making the border not just a political reality but a cosmological truth, a line drawn by the gods themselves. The ancient Greeks were masters of this art, using their rich pantheon of gods and heroes to define the edges of their world. The legendary 12 labors of Hercules are a perfect example. Each labor sent the hero to a location that represented the very fringe of the known and civilized world for a Greek audience. Fetching the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides meant journeying to the far west, a mythical land at the edge of the ocean. Capturing the Cretan bull or the mares of Diomes took him to the distant and often barbaric edges of the Black Sea region. These weren't just exciting adventures, they were narrative expeditions that charted a mental map. They defined a world centered on the Hellenic heartland, with each labor pushing further into the terrifying and monstrous periphery. The message was clear. Within the bounds of these heroic journeys lay the world of reason, philosophy, and polis life civilization. Beyond it lay chaos, monsters, and the unknown, a powerful ideological border that reinforced Greek cultural superiority and justified their view of outsiders as barbarians who existed outside this divinely sanctioned order. This concept of a mythologically enforced south-north divide finds a powerful parallel in the ancient Indian epic, the Ramayana. The story of Prince Rama's quest to rescue his wife Sita from the demon king Ravana is a profound allegory for the clash between defined cultural order and perceived chaos. Rama, the embodiment of Dharma or righteous duty, represents the ordered agrarian kingdom of Ayodhya. His journey to Lanka, the island fortress of Ravana, symbolizes a movement from the sacred heartland into a threatening foreign territory. Lanka, often associated with the island of Sri Lanka, became in the Hindu imagination the symbolic other, a place of dark magic, demonic forces, and moral corruption. The epic doesn't just tell a story of good versus evil. It geographically encodes a cultural and moral border. It reinforced the idea of the Indian subcontinent as a land of Dharma, while lands to the south across the ocean were to be viewed with caution and spiritual suspicion, a narrative that had lasting impacts on regional perceptions and relations. Across the ocean, in the Americas, Native American tribes utilized a different but equally powerful form of mythological border-making. For many tribes, their origin stories were inextricably linked to the specific geography they inhabited. The Apache people, for instance, tell of their emergence into this world through a sacred hole in the earth, often identified with a specific location in the American Southwest. This story didn't just explain their creation, It anchored their entire identity to that landscape, granting them a divine right and responsibility to that territory. Similarly, the Iroquois Confederacy's Great Law of Peace describes their League of Nations as a metaphorical longhouse stretching across what is now New York State, with each member nation having its own hearthfire but sharing a common roof. This powerful imagery created a political and spiritual border that defined who was under the protection of the Great Law and who was outside it. The land itself was woven into their identity, with rivers, mountains, and rock formations serving as eternal monuments to the deeds of their ancestors and spirits, making the border a living, sacred part of their daily existence. These mythologies did more than just draw lines. They provided a deep sense of purpose and belonging that could endure for centuries, outlasting empires and political regimes. A farmer tilling his field near a hero's tomb knew he was standing on ground hallowed by his ancestors. A traveler crossing a river mentioned in an ancient epic felt the weight of that story, understanding he was moving from one conceptual world into another. These narratives offered comfort and order, explaining why the world was the way it was and providing a divine mandate for a people's claim to a territory. They transformed arbitrary geographic features into profound cultural symbols, turning a simple mountain range into the backbone of a nation's identity, or a narrow stretch of water into the boundary between light and darkness. In a world without passports or surveyors' tools, it was these stories, repeated around campfires and sung in temples, that truly taught people where they ended and the rest of the world began. While grand walls and epic myths give us a sweeping view of ancient borders, it is the patient work of archaeology that allows us to touch them, to uncover the gritty, everyday reality of what life was like in these liminal spaces. The soil itself becomes an archive, preserving not just the stones of a fortification but the personal stories of those who guarded it, traded across it, and called it home. Every shard of pottery, every discarded tool, and every worn coin pulled from the ground adds a new sentence to the story of how these divides truly functioned, often revealing a world far more nuanced and interconnected than historical text alone might suggest. Consider the ongoing excavations along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. This isn't just the study of a stone barrier, it's a deep dive into a complete frontier ecosystem. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of the wall's mile castles and forts, but the truly captivating finds are the intimate human artifacts. They've discovered leather shoes still bearing the imprint of their owner's feet, revealing the common soldier's standard issue. They found letters written on thin sheets of wood, like the famous Vindolanda tablets, which include everything from official military reports to personal invitations to birthday parties. One soldier famously writes home requesting more socks. These aren't the grand narratives of emperors, they are the whispers of individual lives, telling us that despite the wall's imposing purpose, the daily reality involved boredom, camaraderie, and a longing for home comforts. The excavation of the civilian settlements, or vici, outside the forts further complicates the picture. They reveal shops, taverns, and homes, proving that the border was a bustling economic zone where Romans and locals interacted constantly, trading goods, ideas, and likely forming families. Moving thousands of years earlier and miles to the east, a different kind of archaeological evidence speaks to the legal and spiritual nature of borders in ancient Mesopotamia. Here, archaeologists have unearthed stone monuments known as kuduras. These were not fortifications but boundary stones, often intricately carved with symbols of gods and inscribed with cuneiform text. They were used to mark the granting of land by a king to a favored official, meticulously detailing the borders of the estate. But a kuduru was more than a simple property deed, it was a sacred contract. The inscriptions typically include lengthy curses, calling upon a host of deities to bring down divine punishment on anyone who dared to move the stone or dispute the boundary. This fusion of law, religion, and geography shows that borders were not just political agreements but were sanctified, their integrity protected by the entire pantheon. To cross such a line was not merely a civil offense, it was an act of impiety. Perhaps the most exciting developments in border archaeology are happening not with a trowel in hand but from the sky. Advanced technologies like LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to map the ground surface through dense vegetation, are revolutionizing our understanding of ancient landscapes. In places like the Amazon rainforest, long thought to be a pristine wilderness with only small, scattered tribes, LiDAR has revealed something astonishing: evidence of vast, complex societies with sophisticated networks of roads, canals, and most intriguingly, large-scale fortifications. The discovery of numerous fortified villages and strategic earthworks suggests that certain regions of the Amazon were once hotly contested borderlands, where communities engaged in significant conflict over resources and territory. This technology is peeling back the jungle canopy to reveal a hidden human history of division and defense that completely upends our previous assumptions about the scale and social complexity of ancient Amazonian cultures. Each of these discoveries, from a soldier's scribbled note to a god's curse on a stone to a laser-revealed earthwork, adds a critical piece to the puzzle. They validate the accounts of historians like Tacitus, but they also frequently challenge the simplistic view of borders as stark, impregnable lines between us and them. The archaeology consistently paints a picture of vibrant, messy, and dynamic zones of interaction. It shows us that a border wall could be both a military barrier and a bustling marketplace, that a boundary stone could be a legal document and a religious object, and that even the most remote jungles were once home to sophisticated societies who negotiated their own landscapes of power and control. The dirt doesn't lie, and it tells a story far richer than any single narrative of division. Yet for all their imposing presence on the landscape and in the minds of people, ancient borders were far from the permanent, unyielding barriers we often imagine them to be. In reality, they possessed a remarkable fluidity, shifting and blurring in response to the powerful currents of human ambition and environmental change. A border that seemed absolute one day could be utterly meaningless the next, redrawn not by surveyors but by the outcome of a single battle or the signature on a peace treaty. The breathtaking speed of Alexander the Great's conquests offers a stunning example of this volatility. In little more than a decade, his armies swept across the known world, from Greece all the way to the banks of the Indus River. The borders of entire empires, the mighty Persian realm included, were simply erased and redrawn according to his will, demonstrating how quickly the political map could be torn up and rewritten by sheer military force. But this fluidity wasn't solely the product of conquest. The death of a powerful ruler could be just as transformative. When Alexander died without a clear heir, his vast domain didn't hold together. It shattered like glass, fracturing into several smaller Hellenistic kingdoms. The borders between the Seleucid Empire in the east and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt were not ancient divides but new lines drawn by his squabbling generals, showing that borders could dissolve as rapidly as they were formed. The natural world itself often acted as the most powerful and unpredictable cartographer, reshaping human territories with a casual indifference to our plans. A river, so often used as a convenient natural border, was a fickle ally. The meandering courses of rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia were constantly shifting over centuries, slowly carrying the border between two city-states with them, leaving farmers on one day to find themselves living in a different kingdom the next without ever moving an inch. More dramatic environmental changes could erase borders entirely. The shifting sands of the Sahara Desert have swallowed entire trade routes and the oasis towns that depended on them, effectively wiping those once vital economic connections off the map. A prolonged drought could force a thriving agricultural society to abandon its frontier lands, contracting its borders inward as the desert expanded outward. Conversely, a period of unusually heavy rainfall might open up new passes through mountain ranges or make previously impassable deserts bloom, creating new corridors for migration and trade that effectively expanded a culture's sphere of influence without a single act of war. The environment was a silent, relentless partner in the drawing of every ancient border, its whims capable of enabling empires or ending them. Perhaps the most subtle and profound force blurring these lines was the slow, steady process of cultural assimilation. When two peoples live in proximity, they inevitably begin to exchange more than just goods. They exchange ideas, customs, and bloodlines. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquests is the classic example of this phenomenon. As Greek colonists settled across the vast expanse from Egypt to India, they didn't simply impose their culture unchanged. They built Greek-style cities with gymnasiums and theaters, but they also adopted local deities, merging them with their own gods to create new syncretic figures like the Greco-Egyptian Serapis. The borders between Greek and Egyptian, or Greek and Persian, became increasingly difficult to discern not on a map, but in the daily life of a citizen who might have a Greek name, worship an Eastern goddess, and conduct business using Aramaic, the lingua franca of the day. This created a vast, interconnected cultural zone where a philosopher from Babylon could feel equally at home in Alexandria, and where artistic styles blended so completely that it became impossible to untangle the threads of influence. The border became a spectrum of identity rather than a sharp line of division. This constant state of flux meant that for many people living in antiquity, the concept of a fixed, permanent border was an abstraction. Their lived reality was one of adaptation. A merchant whose livelihood depended on crossing frontiers became a master of cultural codes, learning multiple languages and customs to navigate these blurred zones successfully. A family living in a border region might find their national allegiance changing multiple times over several generations as empires rose and fell, their identity becoming a layered tapestry of past rulers and influences. This historical reality challenges our modern perception of borders as eternal and immutable. It reminds us that the lines we see on maps are merely snapshots of a single moment in a long, continuous story of change, a story where the only true constant is the human capacity to adapt, blend, and redefine the very idea of where one world ends and another begins. While stone walls and trade routes defined the physical and economic landscapes of ancient borders, these liminal spaces also exerted a powerful and often unseen force on the very fabric of society, reshaping the lives of men, women, and the marginalized in profound and contradictory ways. The frontier was a place where traditional social rules could bend, break, or become brutally enforced, creating unique opportunities for some while reinforcing the subjugation of others. In the highly militarized society of Sparta, the constant state of alert and the perpetual absence of men on military campaigns, often along their contested borders with Messenia, created a social anomaly for Greek women. Spartan women were expected to be physically strong and healthy to bear future warriors, and they managed estates, controlled finances, and enjoyed a level of economic autonomy and freedom of movement that would have been unthinkable for their secluded Athenian counterparts. The border, in this case, indirectly redefined gender roles out of necessity, making Spartan women powerful actors in the domestic sphere while their husbands defended the frontier. This stood in stark contrast to the experience of elite women in the vast Persian Empire, particularly those within the royal household. For them, the opulent palaces of Persepolis and Susa functioned as luxurious prisons, their boundaries defined by high walls and strict protocols of the harem system. This seclusion was a double-edged sword, symbolizing both their exalted status and their profound isolation from the public, political life of the empire. While they could wield significant influence from behind the scenes, their physical world was severely constricted. Their existence was a powerful symbol of the empire's control, demonstrating that the most impenetrable borders could sometimes be the ones built around people, not just territories, separating the elite from the commoner and men from women within the same society. For those on the lower rungs of the social ladder, however, the border could represent a tantalizing chance to escape the rigid hierarchies of their homeland and forge an entirely new identity. The professional mercenary, a common figure in the ancient Mediterranean, sold his skills to whichever state paid the best, whether Greek, Persian, or Egyptian. His loyalty was to his comrades and his contract, not to a king or a polis. By crossing a border, he could effectively shed his old status and be valued purely for his martial ability. Similarly, the Phoenician or Greek merchant who established a trading colony far from home entered a space of relative anonymity where his success was determined by his wits and his goods, not his family's ancestral prestige. In these fluid frontier zones, a person could be reborn, their past less important than their present utility, demonstrating how borders could act as social equalizers for those with the means or the courage to cross them. Yet, this potential for liberation was grotesquely mirrored by the ancient world's most brutal institution, the cross-border slave trade. For millions, the border was not a gateway to opportunity, but a horrific threshold into a life of bondage. The Romans, after conquering a new territory, routinely enslaved vast portions of the population, who were then marched across empires to be sold in markets from Britain to Egypt. The border here was the point of no return. The moment a free person was transformed into property, their identity erased and replaced with that of a commodity. The very trade networks that brought wealth and exotic goods to urban centers also facilitated this unimaginable human suffering, creating a brutal economic hierarchy that stretched across the known world. The border was the engine of this inequality, the mechanism that allowed one society to externalize its violence and exploitation onto another, ensuring a constant supply of Chinese letter labor to maintain its economy and lavish lifestyle. This complex interplay of power and identity at the border reveals that these zones were ultimate testing grounds for social norms. They could empower women in unique ways, grant marginalized men a form of meritocratic freedom, and simultaneously enable the most extreme forms of human subjugation. The same road that carried a hopeful merchant to a new life could also be trod by chains of despairing captives. This duality forces us to look beyond the grand strategy of empires and see the ancient frontier for what it truly was, a human landscape where the constant interplay of danger and opportunity relentlessly challenged and reshaped the concepts of privilege, power, and personhood. It's a common misconception that ancient borders were designed solely to stop things, to halt the movement of people and goods in their tracks, but the reality is far more interesting. These frontiers, often imagined as impenetrable barriers, actually functioned as the ancient world's most dynamic and sophisticated marketplaces. They created regulated zones of controlled interaction, places where the very act of crossing a line added value to a product and where the meeting of different worlds sparked an explosion of cultural and technological exchange. The border was not the end of the road for trade, it was where the real business began. No example illustrates this principle more powerfully than the legendary Silk Road. We often picture this as a single, romantic trail of camels winding through deserts and over mountains, but it was actually a vast and complex network of routes. And along these pathways, borders were not obstacles to be overcome so much as essential institutions. They were the economic engines of the entire system. Major trading hubs like Samarkand or the oasis city of Palmyra grew immensely wealthy not in spite of their position on a frontier, but because of it. They were the gatekeepers. Here, at fortified gates and checkpoints, caravans were stopped, inspected, and taxed. Local rulers and imperial officials understood that this was a tremendous source of revenue. By controlling the border, they could impose tariffs on precious silks, spices, ivory, and gemstones, enriching their coffers and financing the very armies that patrolled the routes to keep them safe for commerce. The border was a customs house, a bank, and a security checkpoint all rolled into one, making travel dangerous but predictable, and for those who could pay, ultimately profitable. This model of using borders to facilitate and control trade was perfected much earlier by the great maritime merchants of the ancient world, the Phoenicians. Hailing from city-states like Tyre and Sidon on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, they were not conquerors seeking vast inland empires. Instead, they were masters of the coastal border. They established a string of trading colonies across the entire Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to Cadiz in Spain. These outposts were not designed to create a territorial empire with hard borders, but to function as neutral ground, cultural and economic bridges. A Phoenician trading post was a place where local Iberian tribes could safely come to barter their silver for finely crafted glassware from the east or dyed purple textiles, a color so rare it was associated with royalty. Most significantly, the Phoenicians brought with them a revolutionary technology, the alphabet. This system of writing, far simpler than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphics of the great empires, was easily adopted and adapted by the people they traded with, including the Greeks. The border, in this case, wasn't just a place to exchange goods. It was a classroom where ideas and technologies were transferred, forever changing the cultural landscape of the ancient world. Perhaps most surprisingly, even the most heavily militarized and ostensibly hostile borders were buzzing with economic activity. Take the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, the Limes, with its imposing walls and garrisons of legionaries. Official Roman policy might have been to keep the Germanic tribes out, but the reality on the ground was a constant, vibrant, and often clandestine trade. Roman soldiers stationed along the Rhine and Danube rivers, far from home and with steady pay, were a lucrative market. Local Germanic artisans produced fine pottery, thick furs for the cold northern winters, and prized amber jewelry from the Baltic coast. These goods were highly desired by the Romans. In return, Germanic chieftains coveted Roman-made weapons, bronze vessels, glassware, and most of all, silver coinage. This exchange happened in shadow markets just beyond the fort gates, through organized truces, or with the tacit approval of officers who looked the other way. This unofficial economy created a strange form of interdependence. The very tribes the wall was meant to defend against also depended on the economic opportunities it presented, and the Roman soldiers relied on the tribes for comforts not supplied by the distant empire. This constant flow of material goods across borders inevitably carried something far more valuable: ideas. A merchant didn't just carry silk, he carried news, religious beliefs, and artistic trends. The border market was a clearinghouse for innovation. A design for a new type of saddle from the steppes of Central Asia could find its way to a Roman blacksmith. A medical technique developed in an Indian university could be discussed by a Greek physician in Alexandria. The spices that flavored food also introduced new concepts of cuisine and health. This cultural diffusion was the unintended, world-changing consequence of economic borders. They forced different peoples into contact, and that contact, whether friendly or fraught with tension, resulted in a constant, slow blending of the world's knowledge and culture. The borders themselves, therefore, were not the end points of civilization but its great catalysts, the pressure points where innovation was born from the necessity of exchange and the human desire for what lay on the other side. While emperors and generals drew lines on maps with ambition and ink, the earth itself often held the final pen, reshaping human territories with the silent, immense power of environmental change. Ancient borders were not just political or military constructs, they were deeply ecological, dancing to the rhythms of climate, weather, and the very health of the land. A prolonged drought could evaporate a kingdom's wealth as surely as an invading army, and a river changing its course could redraw an international boundary overnight, reminding even the most powerful empires that they were ultimately guests in a natural world far greater than themselves. Consider the dramatic and mysterious collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE, history's first great multi-ethnic empire that ruled much of Mesopotamia. For decades, archaeologists and historians puzzled over how such a powerful state could so completely and rapidly disintegrate. The answer, it seems, did not lie in a lost battlefield or a palace coup, but in the very sky above. Analysis of sediment cores from the region reveals evidence of a catastrophic 300-year megadrought, one of the most severe arid periods in the last 10,000 years. This was not merely a few bad harvests, this was an environmental apocalypse. The rain-fed agricultural systems of northern Akkad simply withered and died. The empire's lifeblood grain surpluses that fed its cities and its massive standing army vanished. Starving refugees flooded into the cities, causing social chaos, while the government lost the resources needed to maintain its authority and, crucially, its border garrisons. The defensive walls that were meant to keep out nomadic Amorite tribes from the desert stood unmanned and useless, not because they were breached, but because the soldiers who manned them had starved or deserted. The empire didn't fall to a superior enemy. It crumbled from within, its borders dissolving like dust in the wind, proving that the most formidable army is helpless against a relentless drought. This intimate relationship between environment and territory was the very foundation of ancient Egypt's existence, a civilization that quite literally owed its borders to a river. Each year, the predictable, life-giving flood of the Nile deposited a fresh layer of rich, black silt across its floodplain, creating a narrow ribbon of unimaginable fertility snaking through a vast and unforgiving desert. This annual event didn't just feed Egypt, it defined it. The stark contrast between the black land of the fertile valley and the red land of the desert created a perfectly clear, natural border that required no walls or treaties. Egyptian expansion was therefore not a matter of arbitrary conquest, but a process of filling this available fertile space. Their southern border was set at the Nile's first cataract, a series of rapids at Aswan that made river travel difficult, marking the practical limit of their core agricultural domain. To venture further into the desert was to enter a world of death, a realm of chaos beyond the order of Maat. The Nile didn't just feed Egypt, it drew its map, making the river both the center of their world and the unquestionable boundary of it. A similar story of environmental dependency unfolded centuries later and across the globe, in the lush rainforests of the Maya civilization. The brilliant Maya city-states of the classic period, like Tikal and Palenque, were not reliant on a single river, but on a delicate and complex balance of seasonal rainfall to feed their intricate reservoir systems and support intensive agriculture. Their borders were not static lines but fluid zones of influence that expanded and contracted with the prosperity of each city's king, a prosperity directly tied to the favor of the rain god Chok. Then, around the 9th century CE, high-resolution climate records from lake sediments and stalagmites tell a story of recurring severe droughts, some lasting for decades. The elaborate water management systems that sustained huge populations in great cities simply ran dry. As the pressure mounted, warfare between city-states intensified over scarce resources, but it was a losing battle against the climate. One by one, the great ceremonial centers were abandoned. The jungle, which they had pushed back for centuries, slowly crept in to reclaim its territory. The borders of Maya kingdoms didn't just shift, they vanished entirely, swallowed by the forest, leaving behind empty stone temples as silent monuments to a civilization that ultimately could not control the rains on which it depended. These historical examples force a humbling perspective. We often view borders as symbols of human control over nature, a declaration that this land is ours. But the truth is often the reverse. Borders are a negotiation with nature, a temporary agreement that lasts only as long as the environment permits. A stable climate, a reliable water source, and fertile soil are the unspoken prerequisites for any lasting human division of the world. When those foundations tremble, the mightiest walls and the most fiercely guarded frontiers can become meaningless. The story of ancient borders is therefore a profound lesson in humility, reminding us that our political maps are drawn on a shifting foundation, and that the true power to unite or divide humanity has always resided in the forces of the natural world. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of any ancient border was not the wall itself, but the invisible wall it built inside the human mind. These physical dividers did more than mark the edge of an empire. They carved deep psychological grooves, fostering powerful us versus them mentalities that could harden into cultural DNA, shaping how people saw themselves and others for centuries. This was the true power of the border, its ability to construct a social reality, to define not just where a kingdom ended, but who was considered civilized and who was deemed a savage, an outsider, a threat. It was a tool for building identity, but one that often came at the terrible cost of dehumanizing anyone on the other side. We see this with striking clarity in the ancient Chinese concept of huozia. This wasn't just a geographical term, it was a worldview, a philosophical and cultural framework that placed the Han Chinese at the very center of a civilized world order. Hua referred to the elegance and sophistication of their settled, agricultural society with its written language, complex rituals, and bureaucratic government. Xia evoked the grandeur of their ancient dynasties. Everyone outside this sphere, particularly the nomadic pastoralists of the northern steppes like the Xiongnu or the Mongols, were relegated to the category of Yi or barbarians. These groups were often portrayed as unpredictable, violent, and uncultured, their mobile lifestyle standing in direct opposition to the Chinese ideal of rooted, orderly civilization. This psychological division was incredibly potent. It wasn't merely descriptive, it was justificatory. It provided the intellectual and moral rationale for military expansion, for building the Great Wall, and for policies aimed at civilizing or subjugating neighboring peoples. The border, in this sense, was first drawn in the mind, a line between order and chaos, and then made terrifyingly real in stone and earth. A strikingly parallel mindset flourished on the other side of the world, in the heart of the Roman Empire. The Latin word barbarus was an onomatopoeic term, mimicking what sounded to Roman ears like the unintelligible babbling of foreign languages. But its meaning went far deeper than a simple linguistic observation. To be a barbarian was to exist outside the Roman world of laws, cities, and the refined culture of the Forum and the Baths. The peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube, the Germanic tribes, the Celts, the Sarmatians, were often depicted in Roman literature and art as brutish, irrational, and driven by base impulses. This psychological framing was crucial for Roman imperialism. By dehumanizing these populations, the immense violence of conquest and the brutal exploitation of the frontier could be framed not as aggression, but as a defensive, even civilizing mission. It made the constant military expenditure on the limes seem like a necessary bulwark against a tidal wave of chaos, reinforcing a collective Roman identity built in opposition to a terrifying other. Yet, the human spirit has a stubborn tendency to defy even the most rigid categorizations. For every impulse to build walls and reinforce prejudices, there was a countervailing current of curiosity and admiration. The ancient Greek world, for all its pride in Hellenic culture, produced some of history's most eager students of foreign ideas. Philosophers and historians like Herodotus traveled extensively to Egypt and Persia, not as conquerors but as inquisitive observers. Herodotus's writings are filled with a sense of wonder, not just condescension, as he describes the immense scale of Persian royal roads, the complex religious practices of the Egyptians, and the strange customs of Scythian nomads. While he certainly filtered everything through a Greek lens, his work acknowledges the sophistication and achievements of these other cultures. Pythagoras was said to have studied with Egyptian priests, and much of Greek mathematics and astronomy was profoundly influenced by Babylonian knowledge. This intellectual openness reveals a fascinating duality. The same border that could be a barrier for the soldier could be a gateway for the scholar, proving that these lines in the sand could inspire fear and loathing in some, while sparking a thirst for knowledge and connection in others. This deep psychological impact, this ability to shape everything from foreign policy to artistic expression, is what makes the study of ancient borders so relevant today. The mental maps they created didn't disappear with the empires that drew them. The stereotypes, the ingrained senses of superiority, the ingrained suspicions of outsiders, these are the ghosts of old frontiers, lingering in our collective consciousness long after the walls have crumbled into dust. They remind us that the most difficult borders to cross are rarely the ones made of stone. They are the ones built of inherited prejudice and unchallenged assumption, a testament to the enduring power of a line to divide not just lands but minds. History offers us a profound and often sobering classroom, and the study of ancient borders provides a curriculum with startling relevance for our modern world of passport controls, trade wars, and immigration debates. The choices made by civilizations millennia ago, how they defined their edges, who they let in, and who they kept out, echo powerfully in today's headlines, providing us with critical lessons on the consequences of overreach, the benefits of connection, and the hidden strengths of diversity. Consider the cautionary tale of the Roman Empire's northern frontier. For centuries, the limes stood as a marvel of engineering and military might, a clear line separating the ordered world of Rome from the barbaricum beyond. Yet this very success contained the seeds of decline. The empire's borders became dangerously overextended, stretching its legions thin across thousands of miles of frontier. The financial cost of maintaining these massive static defenses was staggering, draining the imperial treasury and necessitating ever higher taxes that bred resentment within the empire itself. More critically, this rigid, impermeable border created a pressure cooker effect. It blocked the natural, gradual migration and assimilation of Germanic tribes that had occurred for centuries, instead fostering a sense of unified opposition on the other side. When climate change and the movement of the Huns from the east finally put those tribes under immense pressure, they had no peaceful path forward. The result was not a series of small border raids, but a cascading wave of invasions that the overstretched Roman defenses could not contain. The lesson for modern superpowers is unmistakable: a strategy of pure containment and isolation, of building ever higher walls without addressing the underlying pressures that drive people toward them, is ultimately unsustainable and can lead to catastrophic and unforeseen collapse. Yet history is not just a catalogue of failures, it also provides inspiring blueprints for success. Look at the Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes that connected the Han Dynasty in China to the Roman Empire. This was not a demilitarized zone but a space of vibrant, regulated interaction. The great oasis cities like Samarkand and Palmyra thrived precisely because they were borderlands, cosmopolitan hubs where customs were paid, goods were exchanged, and travelers from vastly different cultures were forced to interact. This economic interdependence created a powerful incentive for stability and mutual respect along the route. A Persian king might dislike his Roman counterpart, but he had a vested interest in protecting the caravans carrying silk to the west because his own wealth depended on the taxes they paid. This model of borders as facilitators of managed exchange, rather than as absolute barriers, suggests that our modern globalized economy, for all its faults, is our greatest tool for preventing conflict. When nations are deeply interconnected through trade and supply chains, the cost of war becomes prohibitively high for everyone involved. Perhaps the most vital lesson from antiquity is one that challenges some of the most entrenched modern political rhetoric: that cultural purity is a myth and that societies are strengthened, not weakened, by diversity. The archaeological record along ancient frontiers is clear on this point. The forts of Hadrian's Wall are littered with evidence of cultural blending altars dedicated to both Roman and Celtic gods, Roman officers with Celtic names, and local pottery styles evolving to incorporate Roman designs. This was not a one-way street of conquest. It was a mutual adaptation that created a new, resilient hybrid culture on the frontier. These border regions often became centers of innovation and economic vitality precisely because they were places of meeting and mixing. The constant influx of new ideas, technologies, and perspectives from beyond the border acted as a catalyst for progress. This ancient evidence directly contradicts the fear that immigration and cultural exchange dilute a nation's identity. Instead, it suggests that the most dynamic and successful societies throughout history have been those that embrace their role as crossroads, absorbing the best the world has to offer and synthesizing it into something new and uniquely powerful. These insights from the distant past urge us to fundamentally rethink our modern approach to borders. They are a necessary tool for defining sovereignty and maintaining security, but they need not be instruments of isolation. The challenge for the 21st century is to design border policies that are smart and humane, that can screen for genuine threats while facilitating the legitimate movement of people, goods, and ideas that fuel economic growth and cultural vitality. This means investing in efficient customs infrastructure and international agreements that make trade smoother, not more difficult. It means creating legal and orderly pathways for migration that acknowledge the economic and demographic realities of an interconnected world, recognizing that the human drive to seek a better life is an ancient and powerful force that cannot be simply walled off. Ultimately, the lesson of the Roman limes, the Silk Road, and the blended frontier towns is that our goal should not be to build taller walls, but to build longer tables, to create a world where borders mark places of meeting and exchange, not just lines of division, fostering the cooperation and understanding that are the true foundations of lasting peace and progress. We often picture ancient borders as these absolute, unbreachable barriers, mighty walls standing guard against a chaotic outside world. But this popular image is more myth than reality, a romanticized simplification that misses the fascinating truth of how these divides actually functioned. Take the most iconic border of all, the Great Wall of China. Our imagination serves up a continuous, impregnable stone fortress, but the historical record tells a different story. While it was a formidable military obstacle, the wall was never a perfect seal. Its very design included strategic gates and passes, like the famed Jade Gate, which functioned as official trading posts. For every determined Mongol horseman looking to raid, there were a dozen Silk Road merchants whose caravans were not just allowed through but were actively welcomed and taxed. The wall was as much an economic filter as a military barrier, a place where goods and ideas legally crossed, proving that even the most imposing ancient border had doors built directly into it. And for those who couldn't use the doors, there were always other ways. Historical accounts are filled with stories of invaders simply going around less fortified sections or even bribing corrupt officials to look the other way. The notion of an impenetrable wall is a powerful symbol, but on the ground, it was a porous and pragmatic system of control. This leads us to another stubborn misconception: the idea that ancient borders were always clearly defined lines, akin to the crisp lines we see on modern maps. For many ancient societies, the concept of a precise, linear border was completely foreign. Instead, frontiers were often vast, Chinese letter zones of influence, what historians call marchlands. The edge of a kingdom might be understood as a certain distance from the last major city or up to a particular river bend, but the exact line was frequently contested and fluid. These borders were not drawn on parchment but existed in oral agreements, traditional grazing rights, and the shifting allegiance of local chieftains. A farmer might till his field for years without knowing whether he owed his taxes to one king or another, his land claimed by both and effectively ruled by neither until officials showed up to collect. In places like ancient Mesopotamia, border disputes between city-states were so common that they were recorded on stone monuments called kuduras, which detailed the boundaries of land grants and invoked curses on anyone who dared to move them. The very need for such dramatic curses highlights how fuzzy and frequently disputed these lines really were. They were not fixed but negotiated, constantly evolving through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the raw power of who could project force the farthest into the hinterlands. Perhaps the most profound myth to debunk is the simplistic idea that borders only ever divided people. While they certainly created categories of us and them, they were simultaneously powerful engines of connection and cultural creation. A border is not just a barrier, it's an interface. Think of the Roman limes. Yes, it was a military frontier designed to keep Germanic tribes out, but it also became one of the most vibrant cultural melting pots in the ancient world. Roman forts attracted bustling civilian settlements where legionaries, drawn from every corner of the empire, traded, socialized, and intermarried with the local population. They worshipped hybrid gods, blending Roman deities with local Celtic and Germanic spirits. They created a unique frontier culture with its own dialects, fashions, and cuisine. This wasn't a failure of the border, it was its inevitable function. When you put different groups of people in prolonged contact, even in a context of tension and military standoff, they will find ways to interact. They will trade, they will talk, and they will blend. The border itself creates the conditions for this hybridity, becoming a third space that belongs entirely to neither side but is a unique product of their interaction. By letting go of these myths, we stop seeing ancient borders as simple lines of exclusion and start appreciating them for what they truly were: dynamic, living spaces where division and connection were two sides of the same coin, constantly shaping and reshaping the course of human history. The very tools we use to understand the past are undergoing a revolution, and this seismic shift is completely transforming the field of border studies. We are no longer solely reliant on the trowel and the brush. Today's archaeologists and historians are armed with satellite arrays, DNA sequencers, and powerful computers that allow us to see the ancient world with a clarity that was unimaginable just a generation ago. This isn't just about finding new sites, it's about reinterpreting the very nature of the divides we thought we understood, peeling back layers of history to reveal the hidden human stories written into the landscape and even into the bones of those who lived there. One of the most profound advancements comes from a technique that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction. Isotopic analysis allows scientists to read the chemical signatures locked inside ancient teeth and bones, creating a lifelong travel log for an individual who died thousands of years ago. The food and water we consume contain distinct isotopic ratios based on the local geology, and these markers are incorporated into our bodies. By analyzing the skeleton of a Roman soldier found buried near Hadrian's wall, researchers can now determine if he grew up drinking the water of North Africa, eating the grains of Gaul, or perhaps was even a local Briton who joined the auxiliaries. This moves us beyond broad assumptions and provides direct, personal evidence of migration. We can now identify first-generation immigrants in a frontier cemetery, understand the dietary changes that occurred when someone moved across a border, and finally quantify the incredible diversity that existed within these military zones, proving that the Roman army was a melting pot long before the term was ever coined. From the microscopic level of atoms, we can zoom all the way out to a planetary scale with the help of satellite imagery and LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. Mounted on planes or drones, LiDAR technology fires millions of laser pulses at the ground, effectively digitally stripping away dense forest canopy and vegetation to map the ground surface with incredible precision. This has been nothing short of revolutionary. In the jungles of Central America, LiDAR has revealed that the Maya civilization was far more vast and interconnected than previously believed, uncovering extensive networks of raised causeways, fortifications, and agricultural terraces that suggest borders between city-states were heavily monitored and contested. In the seemingly empty landscapes of the Middle East, satellite photography is identifying ancient trackways, caravanserais, and even faint traces of old walls that are invisible from the ground. These technologies are allowing us to see the big picture, to understand how borders fit into the wider ancient infrastructure of trade, communication, and conflict, transforming empty spaces on the map into complex, managed landscapes. Furthermore, the digital humanities are bringing these borders back to life in ways that a textbook never could. Three-dimensional digital reconstructions of sites like a Roman fort on the German limes are no longer just artists' impressions. Using archaeological data, we can now create immersive virtual environments where we can literally walk through the fort's gates, stand on the ramparts, and see how a century's view would have extended into tribal territory. We can model the movement of goods and people through a border checkpoint, testing theories about how efficient these systems really were. This isn't just about spectacle, it's a powerful analytical tool. By digitally reconstructing the sightlines between watchtowers, for example, historians can test long-held beliefs about signaling and communication along a frontier, potentially revealing weaknesses or ingenious systems of coordination that left no physical trace behind. The convergence of these technologies is pointing toward a future where our understanding of ancient borders is not just more detailed, but fundamentally different. We are moving away from seeing them as simple, static lines and toward understanding them as dynamic, permeable interfaces. The next frontier is proteomics, the study of proteins in ancient remains, which could reveal diseases that spread along trade routes, or even the presence of dairy herds indicating pastoralist activity near agricultural zones. As artificial intelligence begins to analyze vast datasets of archaeological finds, it might identify subtle patterns in pottery styles or weaponry that show how cultural influences bled across a border that was supposed to be impermeable. Each technological leap promises to reveal another layer of complexity, showing us that the story of ancient borders is ultimately the story of human adaptability, proving that even the most imposing wall could never completely stop the innate human drive to connect, trade, and interact with the world on the other side. And so, as we bring our exploration to a close, it becomes strikingly clear that these ancient boundaries were never truly about separation in the way we might think of it today. They were, in their deepest essence, about relationship. Every wall, every river frontier, every cultural line drawn in the sand was a statement about how a society saw itself in relation to the world beyond its control. They were manifestations of human ambition, yes, but also of very human fears, curiosities, and the undeniable need to connect. The Great Wall of China was not just a barrier against the steppe. It was a declaration of a specific way of life, an agrarian, ordered civilization defining itself against the nomadic unknown. The Roman limes was not merely a military line. It was a massive cultural filter where Roman and Germanic worlds met, traded, intermarried, and slowly, irrevocably, blended into something new, creating the very cultural and linguistic foundations of modern Europe that we still see on the map today. These were not inert lines on a landscape, but active, breathing spaces where the course of history was negotiated every single day by soldiers, merchants, families, and farmers. This long view of history offers us a priceless gift, perspective. When we look at our modern world, with its contentious border debates and political divisions, it can feel like we are facing uniquely intractable problems. But the echoes of the past remind us that these are ancient human struggles. The tension between openness and security, between cultural purity and multicultural exchange, between the fear of the outsider and the economic benefit of connection, these are not new dilemmas. They are the same fundamental challenges that the rulers of ancient Egypt, Rome, and China grappled with. The difference is that we have the benefit of their thousands of years of experimentation. We can see the eventual outcome of the Roman Empire's overextension and rigid frontier defense. We can study the incredible flourishing of art, science, and philosophy that occurred along the interconnected routes of the Silk Road. This historical record is not a dusty academic subject. It is a practical guidebook offering us both cautionary tales and inspiring models for how to build a more stable and prosperous future. Perhaps the most profound takeaway from this journey is the understanding that human connection is a force more powerful than any wall ever built. Time and again, we see that the most heavily fortified borders, designed to keep people and ideas out, inevitably become the very places where the most intense cultural blending occurs. Soldiers stationed for decades on a frontier adopt the local customs. Merchants find a way to cross every desert and mountain pass, carrying not just goods but new technologies and beliefs. Languages evolve, religions syncretize, and cuisines blend, creating vibrant, hybrid cultures that are richer and more resilient than their isolated parts. This isn't a failure of the border, It is a testament to the irrepressible human spirit, our innate drive to reach out, to trade, to learn, and to connect with one another. The walls themselves often crumble, but the cultural connections forged at their feet endure for millennia. As you move forward from this video, I encourage you to look at the world around you with these ancient echoes in mind. Look at a modern political map and see the ghost of the Roman limes separating Romance and Germanic languages. Consider how ancient trade routes still influence global economic networks today. And when you encounter debates about modern borders and immigration, remember the long, complex history of human movement and cultural exchange. Understanding that our current moment is just one frame in a very long film can foster a sense of humility and wisdom. It reminds us that while borders are a necessary tool for organizing our world, they need not be barriers to our shared humanity. The past shows us that our greatest achievements have never come from isolation, but from the beautiful, complicated, and often unexpected meetings that happen when different worlds come together. Thank you for taking this journey through time with me. If these stories of our shared past resonated with you, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, do like and subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries of history.